Okay. All right, we're going live now. So the broadcast started, so I'm just gonna copy the link, or I'm just gonna post the link and see if people want to join. All right, hold on 1 second. Okay. All right. So do you want to introduce yourself, or?
Yeah, I am Alexander, the Not So Great on YouTube. Um, I am a 26-year-old, 26-year-old Hispanic American living here in California, Southern California. And should I talk about my upbringing, or should I talk about where I got to my political beliefs today?
Well, I found you through your video titled "My Infatuation with Fascism," and I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that was a little while ago. So, if you want to talk about like that, how you kind of came to your current political beliefs, how your beliefs have changed since that video, etc.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so I do want to point out that video is a little bit outdated, and at the time when I made it, I didn't exactly uh, know too much about it, but you could say that that video was when I was beginning to start looking into it.
Mm.
Um, the reason and how I came to it is kind of a really long and really, really kind of like difficult process. It was not something that I easily came to. I didn't wake up one morning and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna be a fascist. That's not how it goes. Um, but I really think that the biggest wake up call for me, honestly, were several things. One was the 2016 election, which probably was the most one of the craziest elections I have ever seen and probably will ever see in my entire lifetime. That is, if nothing else, uh, as crazy as that will come in the future. Who knows? Another thing was my journalism, because I was studying journalism in college at the time. I used to go to a community college in which I spent 5 years studying communications, journalism, public relations, and one of the reasons why I came to part of what I believe in today is because there's several things like do you know much about journalism by any chance? Do you go to college or anything?
No, I'm pretty familiar with journalism, but I'm not too well versed.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of things that I learned, when writing and reporting news. There were several ethics that you had to follow. There were certain sources that you had to gather. There were certain principles that, as a journalist, that you have to follow if you want to be, considered even remotely, credible. The only difficulty that I had accepting when I was looking at, mainstream news is that a lot of mainstream news outlets don't exactly practice what I was taught in school, which bothered me deeply because, um, if you believe in integrity, if you believe in honesty, um, why exactly were these companies not following that? Uh, like, for example, well, what do you think about mainstream news, for instance? What's your opinion on it?
Well, I think mainstream news is mostly I think it's mostly a corporate-driven sham, right? So I think we can share the belief that mainstream news is not something that's productive or helpful,
No,
largely unethical, etc. I think where we
exactly.
differ is that I think I'm not sure what you think the root of the problem is, but for me, the root of the problem is with journalism is profit. I think a lot of journalists, rather than basing what they do off of integrity, they base it off of what pretty much everything else in capitalism is based off of, and that's the profit motive. And I think that drives them to a lot of unethical practices. I think also a lot of these journalists, their employers and the people who they work for are billionaires, corporations who benefit if these journalists give off a specific narrative that kind of favors their like favors their public image or whatever. So I think that mostly the driving force of the corruption of media is mostly the profit motive in the capitalist structure. But I'm sure you're going to disagree with that. So what do
Oh,
you think
no,
is
no,
the
no, not at all. In fact, actually, what you said literally stole the words right out of my mouth. Part of the reason, the biggest reason why mainstream news is so corrupt, why they constantly lie, and why um, they sensationalize things is primarily profit motivation. I would say that another reason is mainly because they want to influence the public to achieve a certain political outcome. That would be another reason, but the primary the primary motivation for being dishonest and lying all the time is of course the money, because ultimately that's 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 essentially what it all comes down to, is just simply money. And to be honest, that's kind of what made me kind of quit, my journalism major, because I didn't think that, like, it didn't seem like it would be honest work to me. If I was going to be working for a giant corporation where I could be fired for going against whatever agenda it is that the corporation wants, the news corporation, then I could get fired or lose my job or be slandered as some kind of political enemy of some kind. Um, I think with the current beliefs that I have today, I would most certainly get fired from any news corporation. Even, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, yeah. So I think a large chunk of it also has to do with that they want to see a certain political outcome to come out of it from their manipulation and their bias. That's what I also believe.
sure. Yeah, I think so too. I think um, I think it's also largely politically motivated. I would agree, but I think that the root of the political motivation is also profit. It would basically be my analysis. So I think that the political system as a whole is largely a profit-driven sham, right? I think that the government
Exactly.
exists to serve the interests of capitalists, and I think that our modern political system serves that same interest. So yeah, I think we could largely agree as far as the profit motive being largely the driving force of the lack of integrity in modern media. So yeah, so I think we could agree on that. So so I watched your video, and it seemed to me like the main thing for you was you were an ANCAP, correct?
Ooh, okay.
A little
And
while ago. Yeah.
anarcho-capitalism. Honestly, yeah, there was another video that I had not too long ago called "How I Became an Anarchist," and I will admit right now that I do have a little bit of sympathy with anarchist beliefs. I would not classify myself as an anarchist, especially not an ANCAP anymore.
Right. So
Yeah, I've come
okay.
to the conclusion that libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, is really just a gateway to some of the most evil, sneaky, disgusting form of capitalism you could possibly imagine. And to me, that is not a way of building, an ethical or even, a disciplined-based society like I would personally like to envision, honestly.
Sure. So a couple things. So one I would like to ask, what is this society, right? Like this, you say that you don't think that an anarcho-capitalism would lead to the kind of society that you would like to see. What kind of society would you like to see?
Well, what I could first tell you what I don't want to see. Things that I don't want to see is excessive materialism and excessive hedonism, which I do believe anarcho-capitalism will inevitably lead to. Do you know what I mean by materialism and especially hedonism?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like,
Exactly. So
kind of, for lack of a better word, degeneracy type
you could
thing.
call it that. Yeah, you most definitely could call it that. I would not want to see a society filled with people, or overwhelmingly filled with people who solely live for the purpose of pleasure and, and leisure, and, no regard for responsibility or, duty of any kind. Because I think that what that does is that creates a population of morally and spiritually weak, and even physically weak people that are not capable of standing up for others or themselves, or even for their society or nation in which they live in, or that they take for granted.
Hmm. Sure. Yeah. I would agree. I think that a society comprised of, people living purely hedonistically with, no regard for anyone else, I can converge with you that that's not the kind of society that I envision as the end goal of my ideology, or my, set of beliefs. Um, so in your video, you said that you kind of came to the conclusion that you realized that fascism is kind of the way to go, because you saw, all sorts of like violent protests, Antifa, violent anarchists, etc. And you kind of came to the conclusion that the only way to suppress these evils is through a kind of like an authoritarian, fascist government. Is that a view that you still hold, or do you think that's still a valid reason
Well,
of view to your current beliefs?
well, it's funny because, like, I think that we have a different point of. I think that, like, for somebody that's on the far left and somebody who's on the far right, the authoritarianism is in a way subjective, meaning that one person's liberator is another person's, tyrant. The way how I see it. You could argue and say that what I believe is is authoritarian in some way or another. I could say the same thing about your beliefs. I don't really know for sure. I mean, I guess whether or not we judge that to be so, will, as we carry on with this conversation. But yeah, generally speaking, I do want to see a society that's based on, actual law and order, um, and mostly harmony. If you have people that are constantly with no, that are constantly causing trouble, that are constantly a nuisance, this is the thing that I don't like about Antifa, because I would have possibly supported them. In fact, I kind of somewhat did support them during the Occupy Wall Street. You remember Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, if I had things my way, personally, if I had things my way, everyone in Wall Street right now would be hanging from a tree or facing a firing squad. Everyone. Like, those motherfuckers, they need to go, because they're, I don't even want to get into why they need to die, but the point is that those people are pure evil. They have destroyed our economy multiple times, most notably during the Great Depression and the 2008 economic collapse. And I personally wouldn't have. I probably would have, not really shed a tear for Wall Street, if Antifa, or I don't even know if it was Antifa back then, but I mean, the people in a sense kind of resembled Antifa to me because of the chaos they were causing in Wall Street. But the problem I have with Antifa now is that they say that they're fighting Nazis and fascists, but what I see personally is that they're just attacking everyday working class people, like, Republicans, your average, basic normie Republican and conservative. Those are the fascists, and those are the Nazis, according to Antifa. And I don't like seeing, working class people, regardless of whether you're left wing or right wing, or far left or far right, getting attacked and bullied. I don't like seeing that, and that's all I see Antifa doing, which deeply bugs me a lot. If you want to attack people, attack the people that are actually on the top. Why the hell are you going after soft targets? Why are you going after the little guy?
Right. Yeah. No. So I can agree with you to an extent. I think that I think that when it comes to political violence, right? I think that political violence is something that can be by all means philosophically and morally justified. Um,
I would agree with that. Yeah.
sure.
I guess it depends on the motivation. Is what I guess. Um, is where I question whether or not the political violence is just or not. Um, I mean, this might sound surprising coming from someone like me, but I mean, when I look at revolutions like the Cuban Revolution, for example, I don't blame the Cubans whatsoever for, overthrowing the government that they previously had. I don't blame them whatsoever. And I would even argue to say that what they have now is probably slightly better than what they had before.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I can agree with that, and I think that so my moral justification for political violence, and I would agree with you that I think political violence, as it's often exercised, is counterproductive in the modern era.
Oh, absolutely.
I have a
There's no
lot.
doubt about
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are like rah rah, like fist pumping whenever somebody gets punched for having like a Donald Trump sign. I've seen a substantial amount of empirical evidence and studies on the subject which suggest that political violence deters support for one's political cause, given like a normal material condition. And I
that
think
is,
the
yeah,
I think the catch though is that I'm not in principle against political violence. And I think, given the right material conditions, given enough turmoil, enough collapse, um, if these things exist to an extent to which political violence could actualize the actual overthrow of the current system, of the capitalist system, I'm all for it, right? And I think
absolutely, yeah.
my general justification for that is that um, I think it's really weird how we consider violence in society, right? Like, I think a lot of people think like, oh, it's immoral to just, attack the system, to attack, bankers and capitalists and people who defend the capitalist system because they haven't, committed any violence against you. But I would completely disagree with that. I mean, under Trump, like 4 million people lost their health care. Millions of them inevitably will end up dying because of that. What is that if not an action of state violence against the working class? I mean, um, like I mean, if you look at it, like 20 million people die every year from starvation, from dehydration, from preventable causes, even though the capitalist system creates enough food, water, and medicine to sustain the life of everybody on the planet. Yet these people
Yes,
die because the mechanisms of the capitalist structure value need, no, rather value profit instead of need. And so I think these people die because of the maintenance of the capitalist system. So I think that given the amount of violence which is enacted upon innocent people by the mere existence of the capitalist system and the people that uphold it, I think that a violent revolution can be by all means morally justified. And I think given the
exactly.
right material conditions, that's something we should strive for.
Now you see, um, this is you don't mind if I explain exactly what I believe, what I perceive fascism to be, do you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, how I see it is that the two things that I see fascism and communism having in common with each other is the fact that both of them uh, deeply resist against capitalism. They are very anti-capitalist in their political ideology. Where things do differ between the two as economically is where fascism and communism stand in terms of private property. Communism believes that there should be no private property, that it should belong to people, right?
Hmm.
Well, fascism believes that you can have private property, but you're not allowed to do anything you want with your private property. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean.
It like, for example, like maybe let's say like a landlord in an apartment building, for example. You know how like the rents have been skyrocketing and people are struggling to make ends meet in order to even have a place to live, right?
Right.
Under a fascist society, the fascist government would come in to the landlord and tell them, hey, you better not raise the prices up and you better not screw these people over because we'll come in and we're going to make sure that you don't have the ability to do that. They're basically saying that you're allowed to be successful, you're allowed to be rich if you want, but you cannot screw over the people, you cannot abuse the people, and you certainly can't go against the national interests of the nation.
Yeah. So I guess where I would take issue with that is that I think that if you have capitalism, right, just in any form, generalized commodity production, production for exchange value, or to put it simply, markets. I think if you have any market system, even if you have a government alongside that market system, which is the purpose of this government is to control or regulate the market or
Like
whatever.
a centrally planned government, right? Like a centrally planned economy.
Well, I'm not for a governmentally centrally planned economy, but we can get into that a little bit later. But if
Sure.
we're talking about like fascist economics, right, like corporatism or whatever you want to call it, if we're talking about a government which exists alongside a market economy and kind of exists to regulate it, I think it's a little bit unrealistic given how markets inherently like perform like given their inherent tendencies. I think it's a little unrealistic to think that these things can be mitigated with a state or whatever. And I think this is because markets essentially in themselves they have the philosophy of a cancer cell, and that philosophy is growth for the sake of growth. So I think that when you have markets, in order, because of the infinite tendency towards the infinite expansion of capital, what companies are going to do is they're going to keep doing everything in their power to expand profit. And so I think when
Mm.
a market or a company exists alongside a structure like government that they can influence in order to maximize their profit, I think they're going to do that. And I think we've seen that in the US economy. For example, companies have continually influenced government, paid off politicians so that politicians can enact regulations that, help them consolidate more power. And so I think that the issue isn't, that markets can run unfettered, and that we need a power structure to keep the markets in check, because I think any power structure you can establish, if markets can maximize profit by influencing and corrupting these power structures, they're going to do it. I think that the more productive solution that more accurately addresses the problems which me and you are both converging on and agreeing on, we have to abolish markets altogether. We have to abolish the value form which leads to the infinite expansion of capital, to the corruption of regulating governments, and to climate change, to imperialistic wars, etc.
You know what? What you just said right now, I've actually, because in some of the political circles that I'm in and some of the people that I've talked to, and I've talked to all kinds of different people. You're talking about white nationalists, communists, national socialists, people who, do identify with, national socialism. I do want to make it clear that I'm not exactly a proponent of National Socialism, nor do I claim to support everything it claims to support, especially when it comes to race. That could be discussed later in the stream. But I've heard them talk similarly about abolishing markets altogether, almost sounding almost close to what communists are saying in terms of abolishing the capitalist system entirely, because um, because essentially what the reason why they believe that this is necessary is because, for example, if you want to look at it from a national socialist perspective, you want to abolish anything that is a threat to the preservation of, for example, the white race. The race is what matters above anything else, and anything that threatens the existence of your race is immediately to be, to be seen as a threat. And one of those threats is what some of these people have told me is, the capitalist market system altogether, that they should abolish, the market like outright. So I've heard some National Socialists actually talk those talking points before.
Yeah, do you think that's something that you agree with, or are you not sure what?
That I'm still kind of on the fence with, because to some extent I think we do need some form of enterprise, but then again, the whole purpose, like, see, the whole purpose I think of that the market economy should exist for is not for profit, but instead for the nation. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
that is its sole purpose for existing, is to further the nation as a whole. Because if the whole nation improves, then so do the people, including the ones that you could consider that are, like, rich and, wealthy,
Sure.
including
So,
the poor as well.
mhm. So in what way do you think the existence of markets betters the existence of the nation?
Um, like, this is where we get into, like, hedonism and materialism. At the same time, a market could possibly, a market definitely, I think, encourages the production, a healthy production of necessary goods like food, water, clothing, things like that. But then again, you could see a market sort of, cater to the worst of our desires, if you know what I mean, which I don't think is healthy, nor do I think is desirable. Because,
Sure.
yeah, because I don't think it would be healthy. Like, for example, I don't think that, um, like, the sex industry, for example, pornography, sex toys, all that stuff, um, under a fascist society, none of that shit would exist. Absolutely none of it. Because what does it do to better the people? What does it do to better the nation? The answer is it doesn't really do anything. In fact, you could argue that it probably makes things a lot worse, because, for one, it just contributes to people's, you could say arguably it's maybe unnatural desires, or maybe it caters to people's sort of sick desires that they might have in their minds. And it also exploits women. It objectifies women, which, is not the goal of a fascist state.
Yeah, sure. So, so I think that so, just to get into a few more things. So I think that for one, I don't really see a necessity for markets in society. So that's my starting point. I think that people have made the case that we need markets to to be able to efficiently calculate what the price of goods should be. Or how rather, because prices wouldn't exist under communism, the proper analogy would be how goods should be allocated. Prices are a good way to calculate that and organically sort of allocate resources in an efficient way and to produce, etc. I don't find most of these arguments convincing. I think that modern technology is capable of calculating an economy in a way that efficiently allocates goods, much more so, or at least as much as a market is able to do, without the negative externalities of a market, such as climate change, imperialistic war, which is all driven by the profit motive and the tendency towards the infinite expansion of capital. So
Oh, yeah.
Mhm. So I think that markets aren't really something I see a necessity for. I think we can efficiently allocate goods with modern technology, and if we accept the labor theory of value, we can use things like labor output as a way to calculate how we should allocate goods, and so on. So I don't really see a need for markets, and I think we can allocate goods in an economy in an efficient way without the increasingly dangerous negative externalities of markets. And when you get into like fascists who think that there shouldn't be markets, that we should abolish the value form altogether, at that point it basically is communism, right? Because communism essentially is just the negation of capitalist relations, and in
Yeah,
the
that's
abolition
true.
of
Because that's what I
cooperative.
was saying earlier, was that there's actually a lot that communists and fascists do actually have in common with each other. Um, where the differences come in is, like I said, with private property, and to maybe some other extent, ethnicity, race, culture, uh, you know, family. Maybe, I'm not sure, but I mean, well, where do you stand on that stuff? as a communist. You say identify as a Marxist, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So my basic outlook is so I take issue with people who call themselves socialists or communists who take this like this kind of traditionalist or fascist approach of like preserve the white race, preserve the nuclear family, etc. I think these people have a fundamental misunderstanding of how base affects superstructure. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. This is kind of deep into Marxist theory, or not that deep, but alas. So the idea, a core philosophical aspect of Marxism is that the base is essentially the mode of production. Right now, that's capitalism, and the
Hmm.
superstructure, which is broader culture, things like the nuclear family, like the nation, all of these things are products of this mode of production, which emerge out of the mode of production and serve to um, preserve the mode of production. So a good example is what you brought up, is the nuclear family. So the nuclear family didn't exist before the emergence of the capitalist mode of production, right? So like back in like
Mm.
tribal times or whatever, a lot of the times they didn't know whose kid is who. They kind of took care of the kids communally, etc. But with the
Yes.
emergence of like the capitalist system, the privatization of the mode of production came, for example, like the privatization of the family as well. And so we kind of see that the nuclear family is something that emerged out of the mode of production. And I think we can observe ways in which the nuclear family sort of preserves the mode of production. For example, it
Well, this.
like the father passes down his wealth. It kind of like legitimizes that sort of thing. The children give the father a reason to keep working to perpetuate the capitalist system. So my general views on like the family and these broader cultural aspects is that these are things which emerge out of the mode of production and preserve the mode of production. So I think to wish for the abolition of the current mode of production, which I think is by all means necessary, I think it's inconsistent to then also cling to the aspects of the superstructure which preserve it, like the nuclear family.
Yes. I mean, this is probably where you and I are probably going to deeply differ, but I think that the nuclear family is being destroyed merely due to capitalism.
Sorry, you cut out a little bit. Can you restate that? Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Oh, sorry, you were cutting
How
out.
about now?
What was
Hello?
it? Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I can hear you now.
all right, how about now? Can you hear me? Okay. Now, okay, where was I saying? Okay, so like you say, like for example, let's say you have a mother and a father that are constantly working all the time, and they have virtually no time to spend with their kids, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. I think that like this is the problem that I kind of have with like feminism, for example, is because they like during the 1950s and 60s, you had a movement of women that that constantly say that, oh, we're equal to men. We want to be just like men, or that we want to be treated on the same level as men. And so as a result, when you have a huge influx of women that enter the workforce, that enter the capitalist system, whether it was their choice or not, there's a lot of women now these days that are forced to work in this economy, to be essentially another worker, um you know kind of against their will due to the conditions that exist today. You have high rates of of rent for property, for high mortgage rates. You have high cost of bills for utilities. um Women essentially don't have time whatsoever to be stay-at-home mothers, which this might probably get me into a little bit of trouble for saying this, but I personally believe that most women would be rather happy if they were at home raising children, raising a family. But I have no problem whatsoever if a woman so chooses to, enter the workforce if they want to. I'm not against women, going after a career if that is really what they want. But But like for example, when communism collapsed in Russia, allegedly it's said that a lot of women there, now that they were not forced to work according to by what the state says, most women decided to embrace whatever traditional role they had as as the sort of like a Christian society before communism came, and that is that they decided most of them wanted to marry a man and raise children instead of being a worker for the rest of their life. I think that personally, the way how I see it is that the man has to work whether he likes it or not. It doesn't matter whether what makes him happy. What matters is what is best for everyone else. The woman, on the other hand, I believe, um, ideally should be the one raising the family. But if she wanted to work, I think that she should have that choice. But that is not the case in today's society, since I think that a lot of women are forced into the workplace, and that in turn makes them like in the long run, it has the chance to make them miserable because they will get to a point where they have this mindset when they're young that I'm a strong, independent woman and I can continue, and my job is my my motivation for living. And then when they reach a certain age, whether in their 40s or 50s, a lot of women then have the realization, holy crap, I should have gotten married and had children, but now it's hard for me because I'm getting too old and I'm not going to be able to bear kids anymore. So, in a sense, it's kind of this capitalist system that has told women that you're equal to men, that has in a way screwed them over, because then now they're kind of giving in to what I believe is a biological natural instinct that they have, which is to bear and raise children. That they've been screwed over that.
Sure. So, I have to be honest. I was a little bit shocked to hear you say, "I'm going to get in trouble for this," and then give somewhat of a milk toast take on women in the workforce. Usually, when I hear a fascist say, "I'm going to get in trouble for this," they follow that up by screaming about how Jews are, controlling the planet to subvert the white race or whatever. But
Now, well,
but
hold on.
oh, go ahead.
Do you want me to talk about the Jewish question later or now,
Yeah,
or
you
do you
can
want
talk
to not
about
mention it?
we can talk about the Jewish question a little bit later. So I'd like to give my
Sure.
take on women in the workforce. So I'm going to say I think I take a bit more of an extreme approach than even you do, and that I don't think that women should work, but I don't think that men should work either.
Oh wow, really?
Well, it depends on how you define
Damn.
work. So what I mean by work is I don't mean like labor, right? I think labor for the very near future is an inevitability. People are going to have to do labor. But work is characterized under the capitalist mode of production as something you do for a wage to maintain your life for the benefit of the profit of a private corporation. Work under capitalism is something that I think should be abolished altogether. So I don't think women should work, and I don't think men should work. As long as you're defining work as labor, wage labor, which serves the profit of a private corporation or whatever. Um, and I think that this sort of liberal push, which you acknowledged in what you were saying, for to that tells women you're a strong woman, um, you should go into the workforce because you're a strong woman. Um, I agree with you that that's something that I'm against, but I think we're against it for different reasons. I'm not against it because I don't think that, or I'm not against it because I think that men and women are like unequal, and the women, it would be better if the woman had different standards as far as how they conduct themselves in society as opposed to men. I'm against that because I see this, this whole like feminist idea of like, you're a strong woman going to the workforce. I see this as a bourgeois appropriation of a proletarian movement. So I see um, I see the conflict that gave birth to the feminist movement, the gendered conflict, as a product of the capitalist mode of production, is a product of the superstructure. So the turmoil that women have been through, the oppression that they faced, which gave birth to the feminist movement, was something that arose out of the contradictions of class society. And I think that this idea of like women go into the workforce, this modern feminist push like for that is a bourgeois appropriation of an proletariat issue, an issue which emerged out of class contradiction. And now they're trying to appropriate that and say the goal of this women should be equality with men in the capitalist system. You should be able to suffer from wage labor just as much as men. Whereas I don't think that should be the goal of feminism. I mean, I would consider myself a feminist or an egalitarian. Either one, I think the terms are interchangeable. I would consider myself a feminist, but not because I want women to be able to suffer from wage labor just the same as men, but I think that women and men should be both freed from wage labor, both freed from the shackles of the capitalist mode of production. So that's my general take on women in the workplace. I think that women and men should be completely equal. If we're going to define gender as, the societal, like cultural expectations of how women should behave and how men should behave, I would consider myself a gender abolitionist, and that I think that I'm for I'm for abandoning these ideas of how women should behave in society and how men should behave. These societal stigmas which pressure, the different genders into acting certain ways or playing certain roles. I'm against that. So yeah, I guess that's just my general take.
I see. I mean, I probably would disagree a little bit, but I mean, I can see what you're talking about. But you know what? I did want to mention regarding the JQ, where I stand on that. You don't mind if we get into that by any chance?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. And I do want to warn you, this is where some things are going to get a little bit touchy. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So it is my understanding when it comes to capitalism, when it comes to, bourgeois attitudes on, the common people, when it comes to, and this you may agree with this or you may disagree with this. They're most likely going to disagree with this, but even with communism as well, there seems to be, and this is, it's hard to let go of when you notice it, but there seems to be a lot of like a Jewish presence in many of like the more corrupt aspects of capitalism, communism, and feminism, because many of like the major figureheads, like Trotsky, Lenin, arguably Stalin, although it's not really known for sure. Most of like the old feminist movements from the 1800s, a lot of these people seem to have like a Jewish origin of some kind. Now, there's some theories to suggest why exactly they do this. That maybe some of it is probably a biological thing because, like, let's say you get into like Jewish history, for example, what happened to the Jews, which is that they were exiled from Jerusalem, from the former, nation of Israel long ago, like 2,000 years ago, and they were essentially purged from their homeland and forever to be, an exiled people with no national homeland whatsoever. So they're essentially nomads that, are forced to basically survive and explore a world that is generally hostile to them. Now, where exactly the hostility comes from, where, the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, I don't know if you ever heard the argument before of, you have Jews that were kicked out of more than 200 different countries that have existed throughout, the past 2 millennia. And, like, who's the one to blame? Was it the Jews or was it the people that hosted the Jews in their country? What do you think?
Well, it really depends on the circumstance, right? Like, I mean, again, as you said, this is over like 200 incidences, and so there's very different there's very different reasons in each of these circumstances, which we could get into. I think that you're right that there is a sort of Jewish overrepresentation. I think we differ in what this means, though. So, for example, for me, my explanation would be, well, for one, Jews have, on average, higher IQs, right? This is just kind of an undeniable
Oh
fact.
yeah, they're incredibly intelligent people.
Right, yeah. So, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a race realist. I mean, that's maybe something we could get into later if you are. But I think that
Sure.
for a plethora of environmental and historical reasons, Jews do have higher IQs, and this can be traced back for a few reasons. Like, for example, it used to be Jewish tradition that, while in most cultures, a woman would be married off to, or the most powerful woman would be married off to, like, um, uh, the richest man. In Jewish culture, it was always like the smartest man. Like, intelligence was always something that was valued at the forefront in Jewish culture. You can also see that throughout history, Jews have been historically, in many countries, barred from physical labor jobs. And this was for a plethora of geographical reasons. So they were barred from physical labor jobs. So they've kind of adapted throughout history to do jobs such as like money lending, or that sort of things which require like more like higher
Money lending, academia,
yeah, right.
education, things like that, which is
Right.
probably how their high IQ possibly could have evolved over thousands of years. Although IQs and biology was not exactly as well advanced 2,000 years ago, so we don't really exactly have any way of knowing what their intelligence level was back then compared to today.
Right, right. So, so my issue
Yeah.
with the Jewish question is that, while I do think that there is a Jewish overrepresentation in things like in media and banking, I don't think that this is a conspiracy. I don't think this is indicative of any ethnocentricity. I think this is because historically Jews have been forced into these sorts of jobs, so these are the sorts of jobs Jews have adapted to be able to do. But as you mentioned earlier, and I think what you said earlier kind of elucidates my problem with the Jewish question, is that you say Jews are corrupt. Just look at, they have this influence on communism, and they can be found in some of the more pernicious aspects of capitalism. And so I think that this
Yes.
is my problem. So if it were like some conspiracy, or if they were working for some like common interest, for some Jewish interest, why would you find them in the most high-ranking spots in both capitalist organizations and communist organizations? I think you can find that Jews have been historically overrepresented in left-wing academic or intellectual movements, but they've also been overrepresented in right-wing intellectual movements. You can find that while, yes, Jews are overrepresented in these movements, they're often overrepresented in very juxtaposed movements. And it would seem like if they're serving this common interest, or they had this like ethnocentric goal, or if it was this like conspiracy, this wouldn't be the case. You would only find them on one side pushing for this interest, which fascists often claim that they have, right?
Now
They don't seem to have a consistent
you
interest
bring
among themselves.
you brought up an Yeah, like there's an interesting, like, you just mentioned it a second ago, but here's the way I can put it, and I'm putting it in a more very generalized sense, but the way how I've understood it from how people are saying it, there are two major different branches of Judaism in the world. And this is actually a quote from Churchill, by the way, Winston Churchill. He says that one direction is moving towards a more atheistic, communistic, or even egalitarianistic, future, where this one branch of Judaism is moving towards a more egalitarian, society, or that they want to create, an egalitarian world in which not only that they can thrive in, but also like supposedly everyone else, but more importantly, so that they can thrive in, so that they don't have to be, surrounded by hostile Gentiles who may or may not want to kill them. Another branch is the Zionists, the ones who believe that we need to establish a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. That's how you get Israel, for example. Now, whether or not these two sides um, are are at odds is debatable, but you could then argue and say that the more left wing Jews are inadvertently still sort of loyal to the Zionist state, regardless, even if it's at the expense of everybody else, which is part of my problem that I have, not just with left wing and right wing Jews, but most of that it's sort of an issue that I have with Judaism in general.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I do want to make it clear that while sometimes it does come across like I'm like a massive, like, people are going to call me anti-Semitic whether I deny it or not. At this point, I don't exactly care if people call me anti-Semitic. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. It's like, all right, if they're going to call me this anyway, so why the hell should I fight against it? So I don't really care what exactly people think. But what I will say is that with Israel, for example, ever notice how Israel's interests they require, like, for Israel, in order to exist, they need help from everybody else. They need help from the Americans, from the British, from Germany, to supply them with money and weapons that they can use to then, for a lack of a better term, genocide the native inhabitants that occupied that land, but first, for many thousands of years. I don't know where you stand on Israel and Palestine by any chance.
Okay, so yeah, so on the Israel-Palestine conflict, I subscribe to this sort of idea of revolutionary defeatism, the idea that the proletariat don't have anything to gain from picking sides in bourgeois conflicts, but rather that the international proletariat of all of these nations should rise up against the international capitalist class in unison. So that's kind of my take. I don't really pick sides in bourgeois conflicts, which are driven by imperialistic or profit-driven imperialistic interests. But so regarding your point, just to go point by point here, regarding your point of like there are two strains of Jews, and even the liberal secular Jews are kind of loyal to the Zionist state. I don't think that's true. I think that there's historical evidence to the contrary. So specifically, what I'm referring to is if you look at it, the secular left wing Jews, which you're referring to, overwhelmingly supported massive waves of immigration coming into Israel. And it seems like by fascist criteria, by alt-right criteria, encouraging like mass waves of immigration into a country is considered like a genocide, right? Like when Mexicans are mass immigrating into the US, they call it like white genocide. So I don't really see the consistency in the idea that this super ethnocentric group, which is conspiring to further their interests in this really sneaky way, I don't really see the strategic advantage in encouraging the genocide of your own race, as these Jews are doing by alt-right criteria. And furthermore, if you look at like these secular, like liberal Jews, they have the highest intermarriage rate of basically any ethnic group. Like Jews have extremely high intermarriage rates. And again, I think that when whites intermarry, the fascists say, "Oh well, look, they're destroying their own race, they're muddying their race," and I don't know how they can say that. I don't know how the fascists can say this, and then turn around and see that when Jews are intermarrying like extremely high rates, even higher rates than whites, I don't see how they can see that and still maintain the belief that Jews have some like ethnocentric agenda that they're trying to push, It
is a little confusing, but I think I see what you mean. But I mean, going back to Israel, I'm not against the idea of an ethnocentric group, pursuing its interests. so much as that, and it depends on, to what extent. If you're doing so at the expense of others, then to some extent I have a problem. Um, with Israel, it seems like they're using us, they're using our military, the United States military, for essentially their interests. And our military is more than happy to do it, which is part of the reason why looking back, I mean, I never once supported the war in Iraq, but looking at Iraq today, and just how much of a disaster that country is now, it's like we essentially destroyed an entire nation because the Jewish politicians in the United States and Jewish politicians in Israel wanted us to. Like, there's evidence. There's evidence back in the mid-90s of Jewish politicians, but more predominantly like Madeleine Albright. Do you know who Madeleine Albright is?
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
She was the former U.S. Secretary of Defense. I mostly know her as being the woman who went to North Korea and gave Kim Jong Il the basketball. But there's people like her and other Jewish politicians back then who were warmongering that we should go to war with Iraq. We need to attack the Iraqis because they have weapons of mass destruction and just completely false, completely fabricated stuff that is not true whatsoever. And look what happened, just a few years after, once the 90s ended and the new millennia began, we invaded Iraq and destroyed the entire country. Now, today, you have the same politicians of the same tribe, and unfortunately, a lot of Gentiles who are on board with it, like the neocons and the conservatives and Republicans that are now saying that they want a war with Iran. And I swear, like, if a war with Iran were to ever happen, I don't know what I'll do. Like, I sense that I'm probably gonna fucking lose my mind, or just I don't know what I'll do if I live to see a war with Iran happen. I almost want to say that my faith in humanity is going to be completely shattered and destroyed. I would not want to see that happen.
Sure. So I think that
Yeah.
I see what you're saying as far as Israel does all this messed up shit. We help them do that. I think what I take issue with is your framing and the framing of the alt-right as a whole of this is a sort of an ethnic issue or like a race-based issue. I don't think this is based on Israel being made up of Jews. I think that it's very hard to make the argument that Israel has this like ethnocentric interest because they're so ethnocentric and they're doing this on the basis of preserving their ethnicity, when there are citizens in Israel who are like 1/16 Israeli or 1/16 Jewish who are still allowed in Israel. Like, Israel is not an ethno state. There are many people of other races or who are only a very small percentage Jewish who live in Israel, who are legal citizens of Israel. This is because um like there's in the law, you can be less than like 1/20th Jewish and still be a citizen of Israel. So I think to say that Israel
Yeah.
has like this massive like ethnocentric interest and that whatever they do is in the interest of like preserving their ethnicity, I don't really think that this is consistent with the actual situation and laws of Israel as far as citizenship. And furthermore, I think that we can look at other countries which do very similar things, who also do very messed up stuff that the U.S. is very very on board and complacent with. For example, we can look at like Saudi Arabia. We give large amounts of guns to Saudi Arabia. They do very messed up shit with it. They genocide kids in Yemen, and yet there's not.
Oh
I
yeah,
think you
definitely.
can't really argue that they're like a Jewish state. That Saudi Arabia is like a Jewish state. So while I do agree with your analysis of Israel that they do a lot of messed up stuff, that we shouldn't be helping them, that there's a lot of messed up stuff going on with Israel. But I do disagree with the framing that this is like a race-based issue because, is again, to reiterate my points, Israel's not an ethno-state. You can be like less than 1/20th Jewish and still live in Israel. And there are many other countries like Saudi Arabia, which do largely the same kinds of things, despite nobody being able to argue that, these are like Jewish places or that these acts are driven by Jewish things. And so I think that the proper analysis is not that this is a race-based issue, that Jews are the problem. I think if you notice the same thing going on in all of these different countries, among all of these different races, in the US and Saudi Arabia and in Israel, even in Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway who participate in imperialism, I think what you see is that this is not a race-based issue. Profit-driven imperialism and these very messed up acts, which don't benefit anybody but a few profit holders, this is not specific to a race. Rather, it's specific to a mode of production. And I think that it's really
You know what?
capitalism which drives this sort of imperialistic conflict. It's the infinite expansion of capital that drives capitalists to continue expanding their profits by dominating other lands and so on. So I think that the proper analysis is not that, it's Jews who are driving this issue and the proper way to deal with it is to, get rid of the Jews or whatever. I think that the proper analysis is it's capitalism which is driving this issue. And if we want to really overcome it, we should abolish the law of value.
You know what? I I personally agree 100% with what you're saying. Well, maybe 99%, 90%, but you are correct when you say that it's not a race issue. I mean, it could partially be, like, because this is where I'm probably going to get in trouble with some alt-writers, you know, probably some NatSoc out there that is going to, like, you know, get mad at me for saying this. But, I mean, I don't believe that race is the end-all and be-all of human existence. I can understand if there is a particular racial group that, you know, wants to maintain some sort of integrity or loyalty. I'm not going to fault them for that. But me personally, like, for example, I'm not like, I think the idea of getting mad over somebody intermarrying is kind of, you know, dumb, to be honest. I'm not a race purist. And even with fascism, the question of fascism, very few doctrines of fascism, especially when it was first conceived of, very rarely mentioned race as being, like, you know, a sort of like base for their doctrine. The only form of fascism that actually
race, right?
What's that?
Mussolini didn't even believe in race as like a valid concept, right?
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, yeah. He didn't really. That's the funny thing. Yeah, funny you brought up Mussolini, but he didn't really put in like racial laws in Italy until he started seeing like Hitler's, you know, success, whatever success was, you know, that existed in Germany at the time. But the only form of fascism that really made an explicit, you know, that made race explicitly part of its doctrine was German National Socialism.
Sure.
That's pretty much the only version of fascism. But, you know, I mean, I don't personally like German National Socialism as being, you know, representative of all, you know, fascist movements, since many of them differed based on what nation it sprung up in.
Yeah. So what do you think is? Oh, go ahead.
But yeah, I wanted to say that I do agree with you when you say that this whole issue that's going on all over the world is primarily, like, you know, is primarily, you know, profit motivated, because that's really what it's all about. Because, I mean, you could argue and say that, okay, when it comes to the race thing, like with some white nationalists are saying, for example, like, you know, white genocide, they will point to the idea that liberals and progressives are cheering at the fact that white people are going to make up like less than 50% of the population by 2050 or 2060, whatever year they have that they believe this will happen. They'll point to something like that as an evidence of genocide, but that doesn't exactly, because, like, here's the thing, is that there's no, I don't believe personally that there is a definite 100% confirmation that the white race is going to die the next century. I don't believe that's going to happen. I think that's purely hysteria. But I do find a problem with people, cheering on the death of or the decline of white people, because I kind of see that as sort of like a genocidal, attitude to have. I mean, okay, you can probably argue and say that there are things that white people have done in the past that's fucked up and whatever, and okay, that's fine. You can argue that if you want, but I am not big on the whole anti-white, hate train that unfortunately many of the mainstream left are sort of engaged in. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I'm not super into like the whole like white people evil. We should genocide white people. I think that's kind of stupid. But I also think that the outrage over this idea of white genocide is also kind of stupid, because I think that there's not really a danger of white genocide. The first thing that we have to realize is that white people are nowhere near being the minority. They're close to being the minority majority, which means that while yes, they will comprise less than 50% of the population, they still will comprise a much larger portion of the population than any other ethnicity in the US, and they'll still possess much more institutional power, like the vast majority of institutional power, much more so than any other
Now,
race. So this idea of like white
that being
genocide.
said,
Go ahead.
I do want to say, when I look at things like the refugee crisis in Europe going on right now, for example, the refugee crisis is really the result of these imperial powers, Israel, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, essentially destabilizing and destroying most of these countries in the Middle East. So if hadn't all that stuff not happened, if we hadn't been helping Israel, essentially destroy, countries in the Middle East, none of this refugee influx would be happening right now. And if capitalism wasn't, going around the world spreading terror and poverty and hunger and starvation and disease, then you wouldn't see Europe being flooded with, migrants. And like, because this is the thing, I don't think that people who are not, like, I don't think that a large giant influx of Africans and Muslims is ideal for, Europe's future. I mean, I understand if they're going there for, for temporary asylum, while their homes, whatever war is going on in their home country is gonna, hopefully one day be over and they can go back home one day to return back. But I don't think it's a good thing that the Africans and the Muslims are now going to be the new Europeans, and that
Mhm.
going to essentially be made permanent residents or citizens in these countries. Like, I don't want to see that personally happen to Europe, honestly, and I wouldn't wish that on any other country. Like, I wouldn't wish a giant influx of white people to suddenly come into an African country, because then people would say that, oh, that's just colonialism starting up again. But, and then some people, when the anti-white, hate train, will say that, haha, look at these Africans and Muslims coming into Europe. It's like you're getting a taste of your own medicine. It's like, is that what this is really about? Is that you just want to get revenge or something like that? But the point is that I don't feel that the refugee crisis happening to Europe right now, it's not something that I see as a good thing, generally speaking. I understand if we can help these people, just maintain a place to live while their home is being, going through a war. But when I look at, like, for example, Paris, London, Berlin, suddenly becoming like little Saudi Arabia, little Baghdad, or little Mogadishu, like, I don't think that's a good thing, me personally.
Sure. So I think that my general idea on things like immigration is that I don't really think that allowing other races, into a nation or whatever, is really a bad thing. I don't think that I don't think that allowing a lot of like Muslims into your country, or brown people, or Mexicans or whoever, I don't really see this as like this, this destruction of culture, of this, this massive, this problem, as many alt-righters do. And and I'll tell you why. I think that
It depends on to what extent, though. It does depend on to what extent. Like, if you have like a sizable minority that's like, I don't know, maybe like 10%, 20% of the population, I wouldn't see it as a problem. But the moment it starts to overwhelm a native population, that's when I start to kind of draw lines with it. That maybe we should put a stop to it a little bit. Like, for example, with like Japan, I wouldn't want to see, like, because I would not want to see a bunch of Americans, regardless of race, start overwhelming the Japanese, and to the point where like they start to make up half the population. I wouldn't want to see
yeah,
that.
sure. So
Yeah.
here's my issue. So I think that it kind of depends on how you like define like the outsiders, right? Like so my general take is that I don't really think that race is a big deal. I don't think that other races, becoming the majority in a population is really an issue for me because I don't see too many intrinsic differences between races. I think that the differences in things like IQ, which do exist between races, are sort of culturally and environmentally driven, and given like the same environment, given a more globalized society, these things would start to go away. And so I don't really see any inherent differences in qualities between races, which kind of justify this like fear of the other race, or this need to like have a majority of one race over another. I don't really see race as a component when it comes to how I judge things like that. And what's curious to me and what's kind of telling is that you say a lot of things about how like and the alt right in general says a lot of things about how like we don't want Mexicans coming in, we don't want Muslims coming in because they're different, they're going to subvert our culture, etc. But the same exact thing was said about Italians and Irish people back when they were immigrants. I mean, there were sides that said Irish need not apply. Irish people were called like the inside out Negros. A lot of them didn't speak English, etc. And they were sort of seen as the outsider. They were sort of seen as this threat. They were not considered Americans. And fast forward to say now, Irish and Italian people are largely considered Americans. They've assimilated extremely well. They're considered by everybody, even like alt-righters, to be Americans. So I think that what we've seen is that this fear of like the other coming into our nation and destroying our culture is not really justified. And we've seen this fear before, and we've seen it play out in a way which doesn't resemble how the alt-right fear of like the subversion of culture. And I think that we can see this even with modern demographics, which the alt-right is kind of afraid of, like Muslims, for example. If you look at Pew Research results, Muslims, like second generation Muslims and third generation immigrant Muslims, become much more like progressive, much more politically in line with the general population than like first generation immigrant Muslims. Like generation by generation, Muslims become more and more politically in line with the general population. And so what I think you see is that, I don't see this thing of like all of these Muslims coming in or all of these Mexicans coming in and like subverting Western culture. What I see is the same thing that happened with the Italians and the Irish people, is that they're sort of like assimilating to Western culture.
That they will become part of and assimilate to the American culture eventually.
Sure, yeah, basically.
Um,
I think if you look at it like historically and even look at like, how they're assimilating right now, I don't see any real justification for this fear of like Mexicans or Muslims coming in and like subverting
okay.
culture.
Um, okay. Well, I'm going to speak purely for the United States, because for other countries, like, I can't speak for other countries personally, like, because if a country, like if an independent nation, like maybe Japan, Korea, countries that are more or less ethnically homogenous, if they so wanted to choose to remain homogenous and not bar foreigners from becoming residents or citizens, I personally think that that's their right to choose that if they so choose. But I'm going to speak purely for the United States for now. Now, with the United States, it's interesting because I don't think the condition, like with race and ethnicity, the same definitely cannot be said for other countries like our country is, because we are, in the end of the day, a very diverse, very ethnically, mixed country. Um, or like, do you believe in like the sort of like there is a sort of an American identity or an American culture by any chance?
I don't really think that there's such thing as like an American identity or an American culture. I mean, if you look at somebody from like Texas or Alabama and compare them, their values and their way of life and the sort of art they're interested in to someone of like New York, I think you're going to see a difference in culture and in way of life, which resembles like any difference you could see between any two countries in the world, or at least, close.
Yes.
So I don't really see this like unifying American identity that should be preserved.
Well, I mean, this is the way how I see it. Um, as where I stand as a fascist, I think that a nation and its people have to be united together, like the the symbol of goal. Like once, if we are one as an individual stick, you can snap it in half and break it. But if we are multiple sticks bundled together, it can make a deadly weapon. That philosophy, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Regardless of race or ethnicity, I think that if you are an American citizen, if you're a citizen of this country, that we should, in a sense, unite together as one, not divide, regardless of what even your personal political beliefs. Like, I would not mind at all uniting with, a communist, even with like yourself. I wouldn't mind whatsoever, as long as we could unite for a common goal, which is, to take down the imperialist, capitalist, institution that rules our country, and that we could strive for a better future one way or another. Whether if that's fascism or communism, who knows? That's probably to be determined. I don't even. I mean, me personally, I do obviously have the realistic belief that that America is probably not going to become fascistic. But I do believe that if we are to have some sort of future, we have to have a future in which all people of the are united together for a common interest in some way or another. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. So what I kind of hear from you is like a kind of advocation of what a lot of people call like civic nationalism, right? Like, would you say that's an accurate way to define your political beliefs?
In a sense, yeah. In a sense, I would advocate some form of civic nationalism, although there are many, many people in the alt-right and some people that I listen to. I'm not exactly going to specify who these people are, since I don't know how they'll react to me saying their name on this stream. But there are some people that fucking hate civic nationalism. They see it as another form of like Jewish, some sort of like some form of Jewish,
Always the Jews.
subversion, or some plot to, destroy the white race.
Sure.
Which, like I said before, I don't believe the white race is going to go extinct in 100 years. I think there's going to be plenty of white people in the future, for years to come, is my belief.
Yeah.
But
yeah, go ahead.
But I do believe in a form of civic nationalism, because the more we divide ourselves, by class, by race, and I understand that there is a specific identity that some people attach themselves to, whether that's ethnic, cultural, or racial. But I mean, but you have to. I would advocate a movement in which we all come together to see that that we could work towards a better future, that we could all unite to work towards a better, better goals in our lives, improve ourselves, and create stronger families and communities, if that makes any sense. But
yeah.
Then this is why personally I don't believe that the white nationalist, why I don't believe white nationalism, at least in the United States, is even remotely possible or even going to be successful in this particular geographic location, because like, let's say, like, let's just take the most extreme form of white nationalist belief. Um, uh, there's two extremes. There's one that believes in, kicking out every single ethnic minority in the entire, United States. That's simply not going to happen unless you unironically want a race war, which I don't want. I do not want to see a race war at all. So the people that say that Rahowa, gas the kikes, 1488, race war now, those people are probably going to be the first people to die in an actual race war, in my opinion. And I don't think they're the ones that even realize just how hellish an ethnic conflict would actually be. You would get a lot of very innocent, non-whites and a lot of innocent white people brutally massacred and murdered in such a war if that were to happen. For people that claim that they want to save the white race, they're really quick to get into a conflict that will kill off a huge chunk of their own race. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that so my basic view on going back to what we are talking about, like civic nationalism, is so I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but Rudolf Rocker, an anarchist philosopher, and I'm not personally an anarchist, or I don't identify with anarchist philosophy, but Rudolf Rocker, an anarchist philosopher, analyzed nationalism in its relationship in the historical context of the development of the state and the development of the mode of production. And basically what he found is that nationalism historically is the foremost ideology which the bourgeoisie uses to tie the national proletariat to them. So I think nationalism kind of tethers the proletariat of the nation to the bourgeoisie of the nation into one identity, and I think that's counterproductive because I think that nationalism kind of obfuscates the true division, which leads to the majority of the contradictions, which, I think we've both agreed that when it comes to the media, when it comes to imperialistic war, when it comes to all these things, the recurring theme seems to be that it is the value form, it is class contradiction and class society, which gives rise to most of these issues, most of these threats. And so I see that from the things that we've both agreed on, the issues that we've both agreed on, the proper way to most effectively address these issues, which we can both converge on and both recognize, is to address it on the level of class contradiction. It is through an international proletarian movement. And I think that what nationalism does is it obfuscates the true division, that being between the international bourgeoisie and the international proletariat, and replaces it and muddles it over, or dusts it over with this false narrative of national division. It's not the international proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, it's the national bourgeoisie and proletariat bound up in this sort of single nation against these other nations. And I think that's a false way to look at it, because I think that it's not it's not the contradiction between nations which gives rise to most of the issues in our society. It's class contradiction. And therefore, to properly address these issues, we require a movement which addresses this class conflict rather than sort of obfuscating it through these national divisions.
Are you familiar with Kim Il Sung or Ho Chi Minh by any chance?
I am, yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed, and even I've talked to some, personal friends of mine who are, alt-righters. They say that they have an immense amount of respect for Ho Chi Minh and to a lesser extent Kim Il Sung, because they promoted a brand of communism that, to my understanding, is in a sense nationalistic, because like with Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il Sung, they specifically advocated for a Korean or a Vietnamese brand of communism. So like Ho Chi Minh, for example, he was a nationalist in the sense that he had to care for and that he was concerned most about the interests and the well-being of the Vietnamese people, but he was also a communist second, which is actually, I heard that the Soviets didn't exactly like him for that reason. And even when you go down to like the Juche philosophy with Kim Il Sung in North Korea, is that he said in one of his books was that we cannot have a revolution in which all of our idols and all of our heroes are foreign men, Russians, Eastern Europeans of whatever ethnicity. That we need to have a revolution, a socialist revolution that has with Koreans that we can look up to, Korean heroes and Korean people. Because if we got the Koreans, if we wanted the Koreans to really take the revolution seriously and have the revolution in your heart, it could only be done with people who are just like us or of our cultural heritage. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that while I do recognize that there are sort of nationalists who are communists, I disagree with these people, and I think that these people are what I would like to call revisionist, in the sense that I think that the proletariat is an inherently a universal class, and they're bound up in a universal struggle, and I think that the correct way to um, address this issue, or the correct representation of this universal struggle, is a universal revolution. And so I think that while while some communists do make the mistake of clinging to their nation, I think that the nation is a false concept, something that's propagated by the bourgeoisie to tether the international proletariat to them. And so I think that the proper expression of the universal struggle of class conflict is a universal revolution. And so, yeah, I would say that I disagree with the sort of nationalist communists on that issue.
That's where you and I might disagree a little bit, because I think that it is somewhat important to take into account the cultural and ethnic and possibly even racial differences of a said revolution. Like we have to take into account of that, because like you say you're not a race realist. I mean, me personally, like I said, I'm not a racial fascist, like some other people that I know of are, um, or people that I've talked to are. But I do recognize that I personally recognize that there is a racial difference between human beings that I believe is very real, and that I personally believe would be a mistake to dismiss as simply a social construct, because I think that in a sense it is a biological concept, biological reality. That being said, I'm not the type of race realist that advocates against miscegenation, or even like, because even despite the differences between races and humans, I personally do believe in my heart that there is the possibility of people of different racial backgrounds to actually get along and coexist in a society. That's what I believe.
Yeah, I think that so the reason I say that I'm not convinced of this sort of race realism stuff that you bring up is
Yes.
um you say that there's biological differences between races. And I don't disagree with you. I think that there's very noticeable, that like there's just objectively, and I don't mean very noticeable as in they're super profound. I just mean they're noticeable as, that it's not honest to deny that in the modern era there are differences between races and a variety of things. However, you kind of use like loaded terminology, I think, that kind of obfuscates the conversation when you say things like biological reality. Because when I hear you say biological reality, what that sounds like to me is that these differences are intrinsic. These are things which aren't driven environmentally, but rather, are like these intrinsic differences between races. And I don't really buy that. I don't see substantial evidence for that. I think that, to talk about, like, as race realists rely on like this estimate of like heritability, I think that to talk about heritability, for example, obfuscates the division between direct heritability and indirect heritability. I think it was Dickens and Flynn, two biological researchers, who found that something can be extremely heritable and also extremely environmentally influenced. So I think that you're sort of drawing a false dichotomy of, like, is it biological, is it heritable, or is it something that's driven by environment? Because it can be both. But I have yet to see, and when I say both, I mean, like, there can be something that's extremely heritable, but is also driven almost entirely by one's environment, by like external factors. I just don't see enough evidence to convince me that the differences between races are biologically inherent or necessarily exist. Because I think that, what we've seen is that, and what they call it is the Flynn effect, right? So when
Yeah.
blacks so a lot of people say that, oh, blacks have like lower IQs, and the response to that would be, well, that's because of environmental factors. And what Flynn observed is that over time, while people's environment has been getting better, while people's environment has been improving, the average IQ, for example, IQ is something that's frequently brought up by race realists, the average IQ has been going up as environmental circumstances have been getting better for people. And furthermore, a follow-up study found that while circumstances are getting better for everybody, they have been getting better more so for Black people than white people. And in accordance with this, Black IQ, the gap between the Black IQ and the white IQ has been going down as circumstances have been getting better for Black people. So I think that the available empirical evidence does suggest that these differences between races and things like IQ are mostly environmentally driven. These aren't things that are inherent, or like these, necessarily existing biological constructs. And I also think that there isn't any ingrained preference towards one's own race, right? I think that there have been studies which found that the racial sensitivity of the amygdala is heavily dependent on environmental factors, on cultural influence, that the diversity of one's peer group, their surroundings, heavily influences the extent to which they prefer their own race. And that, racial bias, which a lot of people say is intrinsic, and this is why we need an ethnostate, is like entirely dependent on the kid's beliefs, what the kid's taught, the kid's environment, etc. And so I think that these few realizations, when grouped together, the realization that there aren't these biological inherent differences between races, that they're mostly driven by environment, that we don't have this inherent preference for our own race, and that this preference, this racial preference, can be overturned. This doesn't necessarily have to exist. I don't see any.
Well, I mean,
Sure, go ahead.
I could put it this way. I think that by default, most racial groups and ethnicities are probably by default, if are preferred to their race. I mean, that's kind of why there's so many Black people, so many white people, and Asians, for example. But I don't think that it's out of natural order or anything like that for somebody of a different race to be sexually attracted to someone, of another race. This is where I disagree heavily with some of the more hardcore alt-righters, is that, they maintain the stance that race mixing is somehow completely and utterly unnatural and completely, if not totally, immoral. And I mean, they probably wouldn't take my opinion seriously anyways, because I'm a mestizo, I'm a Mexican, my family comes from Mexico, so they probably wouldn't take what I'm saying seriously on the subject matter. But I mean, the way how I see it is that race is not the end all and be all of, like, human existence. I don't think it is. And Yeah, I mean, but I'd also agree. I personally think that the integrity of a racial group um, is somewhat important to consider as well, because like it's hard to put it. The way how I see it is that if a certain race like really so badly wants to like have some form of separatism to some extent, and they want to have a society where their racial interests are addressed. Like I personally can't fault them for that, and I also personally wouldn't be against them for that. Like um but the way how I see it, realistically speaking, is separatism a good way for the United States to go through? I don't think so. Is it a solution? Is it a solution that is viable in other places in the world? Probably yes. Going back to Israel and Palestine, for example, the Jewish Israelis. I mean, regardless of whether like how much Jewish is in them, there's a clear difference between the Arab Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis. The difference is that both the two sides, no matter how different from each other they are, they will endlessly hate each other for till the end of time, and one side is going to try to kill off the other, regardless. I would like to see like Israel and Palestine somehow reach a peace agreement, whether that is total separatism or complete and utter unification. It would be nice to see them unified together as one people and get along together as one nation. But I mean, I don't see that as realistic because the deep hatred that the Palestinians have for the Israelis is is totally unheard of. It's very deep. It goes deep. So I think that the best solution for Israel and Palestine in the long run is total separatism. You have to have a Palestinian state that exists for the sole purpose of the Palestinian people's interests. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so again, to reiterate, my general view is that, and I think the view that's most consistent with scientific evidence is that while there are observable differences between races in a plethora of things, whether that be IQ or performance and in a certain physical feat or whatever, I think that these differences are mostly environmentally driven, and what we've seen through things like the Flynn effect is that as environments change, these differences and these gaps between races, sort of start to disappear. So I don't think that these races.
I'm inclined to believe that with Israel and Palestine because I mean, let's face it. I mean, before World War II ever happened, before the state of Israel even came, generally speaking, Palestinians and Jews have lived in Jerusalem and the greater part of what was formerly mandatory Palestine, have got along, relatively well for many hundreds of years.
Yeah, exactly.
So
So what
where the conflict probably came in was when, is I think part of where the conflict in Israel and Palestine came in is when you had a huge influx of Jews fleeing Europe, coming into Palestine, and I think that's probably was the source of most of like the tension that was building up, and then obviously the creation of the Israeli state is definitely where things took a turn for the worst in terms of Israeli-Palestinian relations.
Yeah, I think what you just demonstrated and what you said and what you demonstrated a little while ago as well, when you're talking about this, I think what you're continually demonstrating is that the conflicts between races, not only, as I talked about, there have been scientific studies that find that the differences between races are environmentally driven, but also the conflicts between races aren't intrinsic to them being different races, but rather these arise out of circumstances which are birthed by this sort of mode of production. For example, conflicts between many races, such as like Israel Palestine, they sort of emerge out of this structure of capital, which leads to, because capital has the tendency to expand indefinitely. what we see is that, these nations sort of start to dominate each other for the interest of profit, and for all these other reasons, to expand markets, because things like things like the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which leads capitalists to have to continue expanding profits through things like imperialism and the domination of other nations, to sustain the economy and things like that. And so I think what you've demonstrated, pretty eloquently, is that, the the conflict between races isn't something that's inherent, but rather something that emerges out of, circumstances which are birthed by the capitalist mode of production. So I think, again, and I think what the conclusion which we keep arriving at is the core contradiction which leads to all of the issues which we're addressing, whether that be, the imperialistic conflict we've both addressed, the sort of like materialistic, like hedonism, the objectification of women, etc. All of these issues which we're converging on and which we're agreeing on seem to be birthed at their core by the capitalist mode of production, by the existence of the law of value, by the expansion of capital, etc. And it seems like, if we are to be consistent, um, in order to most effect, it seems like the undeniable conclusion of this conversation, and, I'm not sure how you could disagree, is that in order to most effectively address all of the issues which we have hitherto identified, um, we should abolish the law of value as a whole. And what comes with that is the sort of the because, as I talked about earlier, once we accept that we need to move past the current mode of production, we can also accept that these sort of cultural constructs, such as the nuclear family, which arise out of this mode of production and preserve the mode of production, are also naturally going to fade away and going to change and adapt, given a new mode of production, which will give rise to a different superstructure, a different, sort of culture which, surrounds it. So I do think that the logical conclusion of this conversation we're having right now is the abandonment of not only the mode of production, but the, sort of like cultural, traditions, which you seem to be very much in favor of. And I guess I'm just kind of curious how you reconcile that contradiction.
Um, the contradiction between cultural traditions and what exactly again?
Well, the contradiction seems to be that you identify consistently these problems, and in every problem you've identified, it seems that at its core, these problems are birthed by the mode of production. So it seems like the undeniable conclusion of what you are saying is that we need to abolish the current mode of production. And once you accept that, you can also accept that the, sort of cultural traditions which you identify which you advocate for, um, which emerged out of the mode of production and serve to, um, propagate the existence of the mode of production. It seems like once you can accept the logical conclusion of your argument, which is that we need to move past the mode of production, it also seems like we can accept that the logical conclusion of that is the abandonment of these sort of like, traditions and aspects of the superstructure which maintain this mode of production, which we can both identify as a problem. So I just like, and because I know since you're a fascist, you identify with a lot of these traditions. So how do you reconcile the fact that the issues you identify are birthed from the mode of production, which the traditions you advocate for sort of propagates the existence of?
Ooh. Well, this is the way how I see it. Ridding ourselves of cultural identity and cultural, traditions, or even, ethnic identity. I see that in a sense, like, because this is the problem that I have, and that is that people are more easily controlled, in a totalitarian society when they don't have an identity whatsoever to, hold on to. So, like, have you ever heard about the concept of the universal brown man, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's this belief that a lot of white nationalists have, that the capitalists want to create, they want to encourage race mixing and white genocide because They want to have like this universal race mixed brown person that has no identity, no culture, or no race to belong to, and therefore they could easily be controlled with hedonistic and materialistic goods and pleasures. And um, I'm inclined to possibly believe that being the case, but not with race mixing. But if you were to get rid of a white person or a black person's, cultural heritage, their European heritage or their African heritage, in a way, I see that as a sort of spiritual death, like a sense of loss of like thousands of years of history that is just going to be, lost forever. And I mean, you could say that this is an emotional argument. Like, in the end of the day, fascists believe that human beings are inherently, spiritual beings, and that we have like a sort of like almost religious significance. But it also doesn't encourage like, a sort of egotism that, we are the center of the universe sort of thing, and that, we understand our place in nature. But at the same time, that in order for a proper society to be maintained, you have to have some sort of cultural heritage or some cultural or something that unites the people, that unites you know, that unites the people for a common interest to strive for a better future. And without that, without the expression of culture, it's more easier for a people to be subjugated, and it's much easier for or even to some extent, it's easier for a race to be wiped out. Although I don't personally believe that, the whole white genocide thing is when we talk about the death of a race, most people like to point out to white genocide. But like, let's go to like, for example, Native Americans. Native American people, by and large, a lot of Native Americans don't speak their original language and tongue that they had before the white man arrived, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of them speak English, and for the most part, many of them have adopted the sort of mainstream, American culture that is in their pop culture. Their the what's it called, the capitalist consumer culture. They've largely adopted that, and very few of them are really into their traditions and their roots. And I think that with capitalism, and I do believe that with communism, the Native Americans eventually will completely lose that altogether. They will lose their language, they will lose the practices that their ancestors had, and they will lose their identity, and they will essentially be reduced to absolutely like whatever they, just basically cogs in a machine, if you know what I'm saying.
Sure. So I guess there's like a sort of I think that there's a couple things to parse through here. So for one, there's the pragmatic argument. For two, there's the spiritual argument, and for three, there's the threat of a race being destroyed. So to go for the first one, the pragmatic argument, which is essentially that if people lose their cultural identity, it's easier for them to sort of succumb to like authoritarianism, to be ruled over, etc. And so people need some sort of identity,
particularly to be ruled over by people who just want to use them for
Yeah.
cheap labor, or for profit gaining. It's
Sure.
easier to economically exploit a people.
Sure. So I think that the point that I would make is that the context which I envision in which this culture would be destroyed, because as I said, culture emerges out of and preserves the mode of production. And so the context I speak of in which this culture would be destroyed and a new culture would emerge is the emergence of a new mode of production. And that mode of production, in the context of what I'm saying, is specifically communism. And I think under a communist framework in which, as Lenin posits, as Engels posits, all political power is abolished. There is no coercive state, and there is no like economic hierarchy as far as people's relationship to the means of production. in the context in which this culture you speak of disappears, I don't really see a danger of people being exploited, because these mechanisms such as the state and consolidation of economic power through like capitalism and private ownership over the means of production, under communism, these mechanisms which could be used to exploit people and subjugate people if they lost their identity, these things would be done away with. So I don't really see the danger of that happening under communism or socialism. And I would also say that the identity is not going to go away with communism, right? Like people are still going to have an identity. People are going to identify with some things. What is that going to be? Well, I don't really know because I'm not a fortune teller. However, I could see the same argument that you're making right now being made by a feudalist, right? So my argument is that, or the core a core aspect of historical materialism is that culture emerges out of the mode of production, and mode of productions, as we've seen historically, do change and do adapt, and new mode of productions arise out of old ones. So, for example, there was a culture which emerged in a superstructure which emerged out of feudalism, and then when capitalism emerged out of feudalism, this sort of culture was done away with. This sort of, this superstructure was done away with, and out of a new production, a new mode of production, a new superstructure emerged. So while it is true that the sort of the culture that emerges out of the mode of production is done away with once that mode of production goes away, that doesn't mean that a new thing that you can identify with, a new culture, a new superstructure, will emerge out of the mode of production that replaces it. And you've proven to me that this does happen, because you are advocating for this culture, this thing that we identify with, that is like this necessity, which didn't always exist. This only existed because it destroyed the culture that preceded it. So you're advocating for a culture that emerged out of or you're advocating for a superstructure which emerged out of the death of the previous superstructure. So clearly, by what you have proven in your own logic and your own argumentation, that the death of a superstructure isn't inherently bad, because a new superstructure will emerge out of the new mode of production, which comes after the superstructure that we're talking about. Second of all, we see the whole spiritual argument of like, and I hear this a lot of like, we have this spiritual connection to the nation, to the family, to the race, to whatever, and sort of to get rid of that is to abandon our spirit. I don't agree with that philosophical analysis, because I think that if you look at it like from a purely historical perspective, um, the family, for example, the nuclear family, is something that emerged out of the capitalist mode of production, something that didn't always exist, something that emerged out of capitalism and exists to propagate capitalism. The nation, similarly, is a concept which only exists because of the mode of production. The nation is just, it's a capitalist structure which only exists in the context of capitalism, because, say, communism is a global society. The things that preceded capitalism, there were really like nations and like tribal societies and so on. And so, and also, when it comes to like the race, I think the race is kind of arbitrary, because there are no, based on the scientific evidence, there's really no inherent biological differences between races, but rather differences which are driven by environment. So in all of the things that, like the family, the nation, the race, I don't see this as some sort of external representation of what's inherent to us. Rather, I see these things as structures which emerge out of the very specific material conditions of our current epoch. And because material conditions are always changing, these are things which are going to be always changing. The structure of families is always going to be changing. The way in which land is sort of divvied up in the organizational structure which land takes, such as like nations, is always going to be changing as the mode of production develops. So too with the race, the concept of like race is always going to be changing as society becomes more globalized and races sort of start to disappear. So I don't see these structures as sort of external representations of something that's inherent to man. Rather, I see these as temporary products of our specific material conditions. And I think that this is validated from a purely historical view. And you also express some concern of like, you know, a race being destroyed. However, I don't really see that as a concern for me, to be honest, because again, there really aren't any inherent differences between races, any like in necessarily existing biological differences between races. There's no scientific evidence to suggest that. And the differences that do exist are due to environment. The conflicts between races that do exist are due to, you know, environmental factors. The preference for one's own race is inherently dependent on cultural influence. The racial sensitivity of the amygdala it requires heavily cultural input, or is heavily dependent on cultural input rather. And so like I think that this idea of like race, of these different races, is kind of arbitrary. And you can say that, well, I value, you know, the idea of this race, and sure, that's fine, like you can say that, but I kind of see that as a baseless dogma, because I don't see any like biological reality or historical reality for like these concrete ideas of like these different races, right? And like I hear like, especially I think what perfectly exemplifies this is like there's a lot of ethno-nationalists, right, who talk about like
Yeah.
the white race. Like if you go back to the time of like the Roman Empire, the idea that like Romans and like Celts and like all of these different factions of white people, or I got that wrong, whatever, all of these different factions of white people that existed at the time, the idea that they all belonged to the same race would have been insane. There was massive conflict between different sects of the white race at the time. And now white nationalists are saying, well, we're all one united race. Like that's never been the case historically. And I think that just kind of proves my point that this idea of race
Well,
division is kind of arbitrary, right? So yeah, I
you
guess,
brought
sure. So go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, you know what? You did bring a good point there. Um, Hundreds of years ago, had you brought up the concept that, you know, to the Europeans that we are one single race, one white race, yeah, you probably would have been laughed at, or you probably would have been, you know, burned at the stake for that. Um, yeah, you know what? When it comes to like white nationalists, and I'm talking about like the really hardcore 1488ers type people, I don't think, like, even I don't believe that they realize certain like differences between people as well, because they assume that pan-European nationalism is somehow going to work, which I personally don't believe would, because even among Europeans, there's a lot of animosity, or there's a lot of, you know, differences culturally between like Poles and Germans, or the Bosnians and Serbs. Although, you know, Bosnia and Serbia, you know, the whole uh, former Yugoslavic Republic, you know, what used to be Yugoslavia, is kind of a perfect demonstration of, you know, ethnic differences, or even you know, or a history between these ethnic groups, you know, just lashing out at each other and causing a major crisis, a war in which, you know, atrocities were committed by both sides. Um, you know, this idea of white unification, I think, is, you know, it is in a sense, you know, a pipe dream. The
Yeah.
same thing also with black unification as well, because there are many, many hundreds, possibly like potentially several thousands of tribes in Africa, and different linguistic groups that, and many people, like, tribalism is a very powerful force in Africa. I don't think a lot of people realize that, and that is that, um, that many wars and genocides have been, you know, have been the result of, you know, a tribal conflict or tribal differences. You know, a person from Nigeria, and you put him in the middle of Somalia, you know, he's gonna stick out like a sore thumb as far as the Somalians are concerned. That he's probably not really gonna be welcomed very much. You know, this idea of like total racial unification, regardless of ethnicity and culture, is a very ignorant stance to have.
Well,
If you're a white nationalist or even a black nationalist.
Yeah, well, the point that I was trying to make is not that it's impossible to unify like different races. I don't think that that's accurate. Again, I think that a large amount of studies have proven that even among children, the extent to which children have a preference for their own race, have hostility towards other races, is like 100% entirely dependent upon, you know, their peer group, what they're taught as children, etc. So I don't think that this like hatred or towards other races or a preference to their own race, prejudice isn't something that's biologically ingrained, but rather something
It
that's
could be. It's
culturally
mostly taught instead of biological.
right. Yeah, and so the point that I was trying to
Yeah,
make is
I can agree with that to some extent.
sure, sure,
Like I think there's still a lot of debate. I still think that there's a debate that can still be had when it comes to, like, you know, where do we get, you know, our prejudices from when it comes to different races. Um, like,
right.
have you ever heard about the have you heard of a guy called alternative hypothesis by any chance?
I'm very familiar with the alternative hypothesis.
Okay. Oh, do you remember his video on the myth of prejudice?
I don't think I saw that one.
Okay, well, the basic point of that video was that Ryan Falk was saying that white people who are, like, you know, the bourgeois class, you know, the very elite liberal left of whites, like to browbeat and sort of like wag their morally superior fingers at the poor white people, you know, the proletariat, what you would call the proletariat whites, for having, you know, a prejudiced view of blacks and browns, you know, and and there's the common myth that, you know, that some leftists have, is that they believe that that rich white people are the most racist, where Ryan Falk says that rich white people are more likely to have a positive view on blacks and other minorities, uh, and that poor white people are more likely to have negative views on blacks and other minorities,
Yeah,
simply
well, I
because
think
of,
that
you know, experiences shared with them.
yeah, well, I think that there's a reason for that. I think that I don't know how familiar you are with Noam Chomsky, but he talks about like I can't remember what he calls it, but it's basically this theory that you know like what you would call like the proletarian whites, like the working class, like sort of white people. They are, of course, locked in the capitalist system. They are exploited. They, you know, they have their surplus value extracted, and they face all of these issues which are imposed upon them from the capitalist class. And
Yes.
so, and they kind of react to that. They have this anger. They have what Marxists call class agitation. And they have to express that
Mm.
agitation somehow. So I think that the bourgeoisie sort of manipulate them because the bourgeoisie, obviously, it's in their interest to preserve their own power. So to keep the white proletariat from directing the class agitation at the bourgeoisie class, they sort of, through media influence and through, you know, ideology and all of these things, sort of direct the white people's class agitation at other races. So, you know, I don't think that it's this, you know, like, you know, ingrained prejudice towards other races, but rather
Now,
a product of ideology.
would you say that class agitation is how do I say it? Class agitation is more or less like manufactured by the elites to keep us fighting with each other, and that how am I trying to say it? Class agitation is I'm trying to think of the right term. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. That ultimately class agitation is something that is manufactured by, you know, the forces that be to keep people fighting with each other. Um, would you agree with that sentiment?
Well, I think that class agitation is an inevitability of capitalism because I think that capitalism is built off of the exploitation and the alienation of the worker, and class agitation is just the natural result of the negative emotions which these things, these mechanisms such as exploitation and alienation, bestow upon the worker. These, like the class
Now,
agitation.
let's say if you were talking to a NatSoc, if you were talking to a National Socialist about this, is this where you would try to tell them that their anger towards, you know, other races is misguided because this is because this is basically class agitation. Was
Yeah,
that correct to say?
precisely. I think that that's the proper way to view it, is that, what you're expressing against Black people is what you're feeling is class agitation, is the effects of living under a system where you are exploited and alienated from your labor, etc. And you are being manipulated by the bourgeoisie to direct that at other races rather than the bourgeoisie themselves, because obviously the bourgeoisie have a vested interest in maintaining their own power, and they can maintain their own in obviously class agitation is a threat to their power. So in order to maintain their power, they have an interest in directing that class agitation at other parties which aren't them, such as other races or other cultures. Um,
Okay. I know exactly where you're going with that. There's actually a lot that I would actually like to. There's an interesting conversation I would like to have with you about that in the future. But unfortunately, I really do hate to cut this short. But I do actually have to kind of go right now because I have a busy day tomorrow. But
oh,
you want yeah, absolutely. But hey, I just wanted to let you know I absolutely appreciate you giving me the chance to have this conversation with you. I really, really enjoyed what we were discussing. There's a lot of differences that me and you do have, but it's like I said earlier, I would not mind at all working with someone of your, political stance if it meant for a better future, for not just me and you, but for all of us in society. You know what I'm saying?
sure, yeah. Yeah, well, it was definitely a pleasure talking to you. I'm glad we could have this
Absolutely.
conversation. I'm glad it was able to stay civil. Um,
Well, yeah, absolutely. And you know what? You have my communication on Discord. If we want to have, I do want to set up another discussion, another stream like this in the future. So I'll keep you updated
yeah,
on that.
for sure.
For
Just keep me
now,
posted.
what's that?
Yeah, just keep me posted for sure.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna post a link to this stream on my channel. You don't mind if I do that?
Yeah, no problem.
Absolutely. And if anybody wants to check out my channel, I mean, I don't really have a posting schedule. I don't really do too much in terms of content creating, but Alexander the Not So Great, you can look up my channel and check out what I have to say, and we could have interesting discussions. And you mouthy infidel,
Yep,
again, thank you very much for setting up this stream. I'm really grateful to
no
you,
problem.
sir.
No problem.
All right. Good night.
All right, good night.